Good evening. My name is Selena Joffrey, and I'm the Director of Business and Policy at Asia Society Texas. We're honored to partner on this program with our good friends at the George H.W. Bush Foundation for U.S. China Relations. Tonight's program is on the future of U.S. policy towards China amid ongoing economic competition and great power dynamics, and how such policy may be impacted by developments in Taiwan and Hong Kong, such as the recent escalation of tensions in the Taiwan Strait and the adoption of the national security law in Hong Kong. To discuss some of these topics, we're honored to welcome Dr. Elizabeth Lauris. She's president of E. Lauris Consulting and professor emeritus of political science at the University of Mary Washington. Dr. Lauris has more than 30 years of experience writing and commenting on the economics, trade strategies, domestic politics, and foreign policies of the US, China, and Taiwan. Dr. Hans Stockton is Dean of the Division of Social and Behavioral Sciences and Global Studies and serves as Chair of International Studies at the University of St. Thomas. He's the founding director of the Taiwan and East Asia Studies program. His areas of specialization are democratization, elections, and security in contemporary Asia Pacific. Rick Waters is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for China, Taiwan, and Mongolia in the Bureau of East Asia and Pacific Affairs. In this role, he supervises the Office of Chinese and Mongolian Affairs and the Taiwan Coordination Staff, and is responsible for the State Department's diplomatic missions in China and Mongolia and the relationship with the American Institute in Taipei. Moderating the program is David Firestein. He's the inaugural president and CEO of the George H.W. Bush Foundation for U.S. China Relations. David is a decorated career U.S. diplomat specializing primarily in U.S. China relations. Following the program, we'll take some viewer questions, so please share your questions through the YouTube comment box. We hope you enjoy the program. Thank you.
Lena, thank you so much for the very kind introduction, and it's really an honor to be on with you this evening. And I want to thank all of our very distinguished panelists for joining us for a discussion of a really important set of topics. It's always a pleasure for us at the George H.W. Bush Foundation for U.S. China Relations to partner with Asia Society Texas and with you, Selena, and your terrific team. And we're really delighted to be able to do so this evening. Before I ask my first question, I just want to say that I know all of our panelists, and we're really fortunate to have such expertise together on such an important and resonant set of topics. And to Rick, to whom I'll address the first question, I just want to say we go back a long way. And as an American citizen, I'm really gratified that China policy, which is not an easy thing to work on these days, is in the hands of really tremendously capable folks such as yourself and Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary Ken Moy and other tremendous experts on China. And thank you for what you do and what the team at the State Department does in the service of our nation. Rick, let me start with my first question to you. The relationship between the United States and China has been in the headlines, to put it mildly, for several years now, and Taiwan and Hong Kong often emerge very prominently in the context of China developments and China news. Could you start out by just laying out an overview of overall U.S. policy toward Taiwan and Hong Kong, as well as any recent developments relating to the two? And in particular, if you could share any key findings from the Hong Kong Policy Act report, which was just released earlier today, that would be really beneficial for all of us.
Absolutely. David, first off, thanks to you and Selena and others who were instrumental in pulling this together. And to Hans and Elizabeth, I have to say I'm forever in your debt. I've read several of your books, and Elizabeth's books on reform, economic reform in China were on my bookshelf during my first and second tours in China. David, to your question, just this morning we released the latest annual Hong Kong Policy Act report. And this report has the headline, Diminished Freedoms. The report, in essence, and it's on our website now, it highlights that while Hong Kong's economic and financial systems do retain some distinctions from mainland China, the differences between the two have narrowed considerably. The picture that we see is business and rule of law risks that were formerly limited to mainland China increasingly becoming a concern in Hong Kong. And in the political realm, I think what we see are that the similarities between the two have grown. We see increasing restrictions on a wide range of rights and freedoms and shrinking space for civil society. And I'd really commend everyone a statement that accompanied the report in which Secretary Blinken stressed that Beijing has been working to dismantle Hong Kong's democratic institutions. And they have placed unprecedented pressure on the judiciary, as we've seen in the recent decision of the British judges just yesterday. They have also stifled academic, cultural, and press freedoms. And his statement lists a number of examples that I know many on the screen are well familiar with, including the arrests of Hong Kong residents, the closure of Apple Daily, and the closure of the June 4th Museum. The other thing that I want to point out from our statement is that our secretary emphasized that this narrowing of the gap will ultimately force many of the city's best and brightest to flee, which is going to have an inevitable impact on Hong Kong's reputation and its competitiveness. And I think it's our view that Hong Kong's position as a global financial center will continue to suffer as a result. I mean, these rapidly developing changes do raise a number of questions, fundamental ones regarding Hong Kong's future. So you had asked initially that I lay out a quick frame of our policy towards Hong Kong, and I want to briefly place today's statement in a context, and then I'll turn briefly to Taiwan, and we can talk more in the question section. The Hong Kong Policy Act and two subsequent pieces of legislation have been the basis of our policy towards Hong Kong since the handover in 1997, and the policy of differentiated treatment between how we viewed Hong Kong and how we viewed the mainland was derivative from this legislation, and it persisted through monumental events in 2003 and 2012, the Umbrella Revolution, even through the debates over the Fugitive Offenders Ordinance in 2019. But it was really 2020 that proved the tipping point when the national security law led the previous administration to certify for the first time formally that Hong Kong no longer enjoyed sufficient autonomy under U.S. law to merit differentiated treatment. And I think the unfortunate series of events that we've seen over the past year validate that judgment, which is the basis for our report and our statement today. Now, I know my time is limited and we want to get to the others and then have time for questions. So on Taiwan, I'll just mention briefly that the events in Ukraine and the monumental historical moment that we're in right now, are worth considering. But what has not changed is the framework of our approach towards the cross-strait situation or the unofficial nature of our strong, rock-solid relationship with Taiwan. I'd highlight a few key elements of the framework and one key event. Shortly after the conflict in Ukraine broke out, an unofficial delegation led by retired Admiral Mike Mullen went to Taiwan on March 1st and 2nd. And I think this delegation sent an important signal about the depth of our commitment to Taiwan and its democracy. But even before that delegation, I think it's important to bear in mind that the nature of our relationship, which I think Hans and others have written a great deal about, is quite robust and often underappreciated. And I don't want it to be lost in discussion of cross-strait issues, that this is a relationship with a leading democracy, our eighth largest trading partner, a source of jobs for 35 billion in outbound exports last year, and a source of inbound investment to the U.S., most notably in the form of a $12 billion semiconductor fab that's under construction right now. So this is really, I think, the a few examples of the importance of the U.S.-Taiwan unofficial relationship. But with regard to our cross-strait policy, our administration remains committed to the basic framework, which is guided by the Taiwan Relations Act, the 3 joint communiques, and the 6 assurances that were recently declassified under the previous administration. And we believe this policy has been instrumental in maintaining peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait for nearly 50 years. Our goal is to maintain a stable environment that would allow for dialogue to take place free of coercion. But fundamentally, we also remain bound by the Taiwan Relations Act to assist Taiwan in maintaining its own self-defense capability. We have sold 32 billion in arms since 2009. And I really think it's important, and I'll sort of end with this thought, to look carefully at the framework of the Taiwan Relations Act and some of its actual language. It requires us, among other things, as a matter of policy, to maintain the capacity to resist coercive actions that would jeopardize the security or the social or economic system of the people of Taiwan. So, David, I'll stop there. But again, thank you, and thanks to everyone else for putting this together this evening.
Yeah. Rick, thank you so much. That is a really helpful set of comments and a framework for understanding where the USG is on these really important issues. So thank you again for sharing that. I want to turn to Elizabeth and Hans, I think in that order, to just come in on the topic of Hong Kong. It has been, particularly since, as Rick noted, since the advent of the national security law in June of 2020, a major issue in the U.S. China relationship and a major issue for Hong Kong. Elizabeth, what do you see in terms of the current state of play in Hong Kong and where things are going in terms of a trend line? And then I'd like to come to Hans on Hong Kong as well.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me on tonight. I see that American businesses have suffered a double whammy in Hong Kong over the past 2 years. Of course, the first one was COVID, but Hong Kong initially was not as impacted by COVID as, let's say, Italy or some other countries. People were still going to work, they were wearing masks, life was going on pretty much as usual. And then with the national security law coming in, that was a big blow to freedom of expression and really made a lot of people in Hong Kong nervous. The business sentiments report, AmCham came out with a business sentiments report in January that indicated that on a personal level, about 40% of American businessmen and women were thinking of leaving Hong Kong. 25% of Americans are considering leaving, and about 5% of businesses headquartered in Hong Kong were thinking of leaving. And then 8 out of 10 businesses said that they were affected by the national security law and that it was hurting employee morale and that a number of their employees had decided to leave. Now, a lot of employees left not just because of the national security law, but also because of COVID. As the Hong Kong government tightened up movements and mobility because of the COVID situation there, the double whammy just made Hong Kong that, much less attractive to do business there. I mean, people have to go over, they had to quarantine for 3 weeks. So when you're sending, your partner over, your movers and shakers, they're not going to quarantine for 3 weeks. And so it's a really, really difficult way to do business. And then the other thing that Rick had mentioned was the Court of Appeal, the final Court of Appeal, that because people have concerns about the national security law, cracking down, squelching, I suppose is the best way, limiting freedom of expression, that two British non-permanent justices just announced that they were stepping down from the final court of appeals. And that it was essentially a vote of no confidence in the Hong Kong government, saying that we disagree with your assurances that the national security law is not affecting freedom of expression in Hong Kong. So that's pointing to a pretty bad sign as well.
Yeah, Elizabeth, thank you so much. And staying on the topic of Hong Kong and going to Hans Stockton, a lot of commentators have observed that in Hong Kong, the era of one country, two systems is now over. And basically, it kind of came to a conclusion with the adoption of the National Security Law of June 2020. In your view, Hans, and perhaps Rick and Elizabeth could weigh in on this as well in a minute, is that a reasonable assessment? Can we now kind of officially say that one country, two systems, as it governed Taiwan over these last several decades, is now a thing of the past?
Thank you, David. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here tonight, and I would certainly say it's a safe bet at least in the near future, that one country, two systems support on Taiwan is dead. It's the 2020 umbrella protests, the suppression of that security law, it really convinced citizens in Taiwan that this was just not going to be an option for them in the future. Survey after survey shows overwhelming percentages opposed to a one country, two systems framework, and really the only way the Chinese government is presenting it now through the 1992 consensus. And of course, the current president in Taiwan, Tsai Ing-wen, has refused to even acknowledge it as a reality, let alone agree to the interpretation presented. And so, without a doubt, this is a non-starter, and of course that introduces the dynamic in Taiwan domestic politics, how the Chinese Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang, finds ways to repackage and sell that to voters and win elections.
Yeah. Rick, let me ask you, what is your take, and where is the USG on kind of the issue of the impact of what has happened in Hong Kong on any construct of one country, two systems? It was on shaky ground, I think, before 2020, but is it a concept that is now totally discredited by what we've seen happen in Hong Kong over the last 2 years?
I think, David, we've spoken pretty clearly in the Hong Kong context through our Policy Act statements and elsewhere. I would say with regard to Taiwan, the challenge is that the value proposition the mainland seems to be offering at present is one of coercion, whether it's military or diplomatic or disinformation. And that's been the case with alarming frequency since 2016. And so while our policy, is bound in part by a willingness to leave open the possibility of peaceful resolution that is free from coercion, we are very concerned about these coercive tactics that have increasingly become, a dominant focus of the mainland's cross-strait policies.
Yeah. Let me ask this question because I think a couple of speakers have touched on it, but the impact of developments in Hong Kong on Taiwan's sentiment. I think there's no question that, one of the things I've seen, and I think all of us have seen in our experience dealing with Taiwan over the last several decades, is that, the people look at what China does in Hong Kong and what China does more generally, and they form conclusions and they come to judgments about whether China is credible in its offering of a kind of one country, two systems. More generally, what has been the effect in Taiwan in terms of Taiwan's sentiment regarding reunification or unification generated by what we've seen happen in Hong Kong? It seems to me that this has really been, it's really set back China's own self-declared goal of kind of trying to win hearts and minds in Taiwan. Hans, is that something that you've seen as you looked at the issue, as you've looked at this issue in terms of Taiwan sentiment?
Oh, absolutely. And you can go back to the summer of 2019, just prior to the January 2020 presidential elections in Taiwan, when Tsai Ing-wen was lagging in opinion polling by quite a bit to her opponent. And the correlation with the security or the events in Hong Kong generally really fed her campaign. That was only one element of her recovery in public opinion, but it gave her a golden opportunity to revive her campaign against the Kuomintang. It's important to note as well, though, that while the Taiwanese are very, very skittish about reunification, one country, two systems, the largest chunk of voter, or those polled at least, still favor a status quo. And so it's still very patient, always characterized as a very pragmatic population. They continue to engage economically like gangbusters with the mainland, with I think overall trade like up 25% in 2021. So there is a lot of pragmatism that is very much just under the surface of political rhetoric.
Elizabeth, let me ask you this question, also on a related note in terms of Taiwan sentiment. Do you think that the Chinese leadership is aware or unaware that its actions in Hong Kong have and elsewhere for that matter, have implications for sentiment in Taiwan that often take Taiwan sentiment in a direction that presumably the mainland leadership doesn't want to see? But is there a cognizance that they're in some ways doing things that are counterproductive as viewed through the prism of their own stated goals?
According to my research, now when I was doing research across the Taiwan Strait before COVID, it was clear that the people, at least the scholars I spoke with, really understood, yes, that a lot of people in Taiwan were not favorably disposed, at least to the political system, in China, and increasingly they were identifying more as Taiwanese and less as Chinese. The Hong Kong protests, the national imposition of the national security law in Hong Kong, has coincided with really robust development of Taiwan nationalism and Taiwan identity. And the more that Beijing tightens up on Hong Kong, the more it appears that the people in Taiwan, and I'm not saying it's cause and effect, but I'm saying at the same time, the younger people in Taiwan identify now as Taiwanese, not even part Chinese, part Taiwanese, but almost solely Taiwanese. So that's happening at the same time. And what I got from my research is that the authorities in China really don't care. Like the whole issue of Taiwan unification is untouchable. Any talk of permanent separation or extended status quo is a non-starter. And I remember talking with some, people in the mainland and saying, well, why would the Taiwan people want to join politically with China? They have a lot to lose. And it was probably a pretty bold question for an academic, to ask of the Chinese. And they just thought that was absolutely ludicrous, that it wasn't what the Taiwan people want, it's what must happen. So they are aware of what is going on. And now remember, the issue of one country, two systems was originally designed and floated for Taiwan back in the 1980s, right, under Deng Xiaoping, but they didn't bite. So that's why they applied it to mainland China. So to Hong Kong. So it was never really an issue in Taiwan, but it's even less of an issue now. Do you remember when Han Kuo-yu was running for president? He was the mayor of Kaohsiung, and people were concerned he was too close to the mainland. But even he had rejected one country, two systems for Taiwan. So it's a non-starter in Taiwan, but the mainland doesn't seem to care about Taiwan sentiment.
Thanks, Elizabeth. On Taiwan, let me go to Rick with this question. One of the things that many of us have read about over the last number of years is an increasing usage of basically military incursions into what Taiwan regards as its air defense identification zone by the mainland, seemingly in an effort to intimidate Taiwan. Rick, could you kind of talk to us about what's happening in this particular regard and what China is trying to achieve and where you think this set of actions is going as we go forward? There seemingly has been a trend line toward an increase in the number of these incursions, and I know that's something that's viewed with concern and alarm in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, David, I think you've said it well. I mean, we're seeing a lot of those trends, and we do view them with concern. It's difficult to understand how that contributes to peace and stability in the region. And I think our view is not limited to us. I mean, it's limited to it extends to many of our allies and partners in the region with whom we've got close consultation on these issues. I think you've also started to see an increasing focus in some of our leadership statements, including in the G7 last year, where you're starting to see leadership groupings and allies and partners speak more openly about the importance of stability in the cross-strait context. And it's not unrelated to the trend line you describe.
Yeah. Let me ask kind of a related question, and this touches on, Rick, something that you referenced in your opening comments in terms of Ukraine. In the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, many commentators have speculated on the degree to which events in Ukraine might affect China's thinking or future actions with respect to Taiwan. And some posit that China may soon seek to go into Taiwan in much the way that Russia has gone into Ukraine. So my question for all of you, maybe starting with Hans, is conflagration across the Taiwan Strait, and specifically a Chinese military, an attempt at a Chinese military takeover of Taiwan, something that is now more likely because of what has transpired in Ukraine, or not necessarily? Hans, maybe we could start with you on that one.
Well, David, I hate to sound like a lawyer, but I think it depends. No, actually, I'd like to think that how events have unfolded in the Ukraine have encouraged the government in Beijing to reconsider some aspects or elements or timing of hostility towards Taiwan. I think we're all learning a lot of lessons about assuming that mass firepower is going to, provide for a quick victory. The capacity of populations to resist an invading force with some support, and so my initial hunch is this would put off Chinese aggression for a little bit of time while they consume intelligence and they recalculate. Maybe that's as much of a hope as it is kind of a reality. But I think the Chinese are probably reconsidering a lot of assumptions they'd made prior to the Russian invasion.
Thanks, Hans. Elizabeth, is there anything you would add to that? And maybe, again, Rick, if you'd like to add anything after Elizabeth, we'd certainly value your take as well.
So if we're talking about timeframes, I certainly do not anticipate that Xi Jinping and company would do anything before the Party Congress, which will be in October of this year. This is when Xi Jinping will begin his unprecedented third term as party general secretary, but also as chairman of state. So he's not going to do anything to jeopardize that. And then afterwards, to be honest, then you start getting into 2023. And in November, Taiwan will have those local elections. They're called the 9-in-1 elections. And if I was Xi Jinping, I would see how sentiment was blowing in Taiwan to see if the DPP would be weakened or if the nationalists pick up a bunch of mayoral, seats, magistrate seats, legislative seats. And then we're into 24, where there will be a presidential election in Taiwan. And, there's a possibility that the Kuomintang, the nationalists, will come back. And I'm not putting money on, I don't have a horse in that race, but we look at, the pendulum, where the pendulum swings, even the United States, Republican, Democrat, blah, blah, blah. And so, you might see, okay, DPP back to the nationalists. And the nationalists might be more, make more overtures toward Beijing. So I don't see that Beijing needs to use force. Now, there's a lot that can happen between now and those presidential elections in 2024. And if things go sour across the Taiwan Strait, I would expect if Xi Jinping decided to bust a move, that he would go big or go home. Because what he has seen, I'm sure the message he got in Ukraine is that Putin didn't go in big enough. He didn't pull out all the big guns, literally. And so that if he's going to take Taiwan, he's going to have to hit it really hard, first with non-kinetic electronic warfare, take out communications, command posts, and then hit it really hard with kinetic. But, we hope, of course we hope, that it doesn't come to that. So we'll just have to kind of watch the tea leaves in the next few months.
Elizabeth, thank you so much for that. And Rick, I would just say, from where you sit, do you think what's happened in terms of Russia, Ukraine, increases the likelihood of a Chinese action relative to Taiwan, or not necessarily?
Well, I think, David, that we focused mainly on the implications of the joint statement on February 4th that Xi Jinping announced with Vladimir Putin. And, I think for us, we're very clear-eyed about what this means, the language in that statement, the description of a no limits friendship, the embrace of spheres of influence. We are watching very closely, particularly in the Ukraine context, whether the PRC tries to go beyond these statements, what their actions tell us. And I have to say, a lot of our diplomacy in recent weeks, including the president's nearly 2-hour phone call with Xi Jinping, is focused on this issue. It's focused on making clear our concerns about the implications of China's actions in the Ukraine context. So I'll leave it to others, to derive judgments about what this means, more broadly. But I will say that we've been very actively involved, and we have been watching very closely the meaning of that February 4th statement.
Thanks, Rick. And let me follow up with you on a question that I know you have deep expertise on, and that's the issue of the one China policy of the United States. Chinese officials and other commentators have argued over the last several years that the United States seems to be moving away from its traditional one China policy posture, or at a minimum, interpreting the existing one China policy in a way that is qualitatively different from what was seen under all presidents prior to President Donald Trump. Do you see a qualitative change in the way that the United States now interprets and implements its own self-declared one China policy?
David, I think the Chinese may find it convenient to put out that narrative, but I mentioned in my initial remarks the foundational elements of our policy, all of which remain constant and consistent over that period. And I think that the reality is that the Chinese have been trying for years to unilaterally redefine elements of our one China policy. Last fall, we pointed out that they had been attempting to misuse UNGA Resolution 2758 to imply that it meant more than the text of the document says. And so I can tell you that our policy remains bound by a consistent framework over the period since the 3 joint communiques and the Taiwan Relations Act.
Rick, thank you so much. Let me ask really just one more question of each of you before we go into the segment of the show, of this event rather, where we have some questions from folks who are viewing this discussion. And I think the final question that I would ask each of you, maybe starting with Hans and then going to Elizabeth and then to Rick, is, and this has been referenced by a couple of speakers, as we look ahead to the remainder of this year, and it's a very important political year for both countries in terms of the US midterms and the Chinese 20th Party Congress. And as we look beyond this year into the remainder of the Biden administration and even beyond that, how do you assess the overall prospects for the US China relationship? And what are the issues that you're worried about the most or that you think merit the greatest attention in terms of the possibility to generate even greater friction in the relationship than what we see now? Let's go to Hans first in terms of looking ahead and sharing your assessment of where this relationship is going, and then to Elizabeth and Rick.
Well, you know, David, I think one of the bellwethers I'm looking at right now would be the final form of the America Competes Act, versions, very different versions of which have, I think, now made it through House and Senate. And to see what final form that law or that bill will take, the language, the focus, I think that's a pending signal to us. Second would be the ongoing debate in the United States in particular about the U.S. support of Taiwan and strategic ambiguity versus strategic clarity. There's another version that's come up, dual clarity. So there are all these various combinations. Will an administration let itself be forced into some sort of explicit statement? The third issue would be watching the China-Russia relationship and just how deep it becomes, how reliable a partner they make for each other. And then, of course, you know, not forgetting North Korea and its recent cry for attention from the world. Cyber espionage, cyber theft, and the potential for cyber warfare are going to be very important issues to watch between U.S. and China relations. And then, of course, you know, Dr. Laris laid out a real nice timeline over the next couple, 2-3 years, as far as key elections and in the U.S. as well as Taiwan, and of course, party events in China. So it's going to be nonstop, but we have these little checkpoints along the way, I think, that are going to be very helpful in helping us understand the direction of things.
Hans, thank you so much. Really appreciate that. Elizabeth, what's your take on where this relationship is going?
Well, it certainly will continue to be chilly, probably will become chillier. I think it was the 116th Congress was the most critical Congress of China in like 40 years, you know, something like that. And it's interesting that with a lot of division in US politics, a bipartisan issue is Taiwan, you know, to varying degrees. But, you know, really both Democrats and Republicans do kind of reach across the aisle when it comes to Taiwan, which is good for Taiwan. And as Hans mentioned, you know, the America Competes Act is going to be something to watch because there is a provision in there to increase cultural exchanges and some other things with Taiwan. I thought it was interesting, Catherine Tai's testimony before Congress, I believe it was yesterday, where she said we really need to bring more manufacturing capability back to the United States, that we have made ourselves vulnerable by allowing our businesses, our manufacturing, our supply chain to be dependent on unfriendly nations. And, you know, she didn't say I don't think she said it's a national security risk, but it is. And I believe the Biden administration is saying, yeah, that's a national security risk. I think Rubio even said it's a risk when 80% of your pharmaceuticals are being made in China, which, you know, most of Congress considers to be an unfriendly nation. So I think we're going to see more and more retrenchment We will certainly continue robust economic ties with China just out of necessity. But we will see, more probably companies leaving Hong Kong, leaving China, as China does not appear to be lifting its zero tolerance of COVID policies soon. I mean, it's shortened up, like the quarantine protocols and the shutdowns of the factories. Instead of 2 weeks, it's like 3 days or something like that now. But it's pretty difficult, my understanding now, for foreign businesses in China. So I expect a lot of them, if they don't come back to the US, they're going to go to some other country.
Elizabeth, thank you so much. Rick, what would you share with us from a USG perspective as far as what you're seeing in the relationship, where it's going over the rest of this year and beyond?
Well, David, let me start with our overall framework for managing the relationship, which really starts with the point that Elizabeth made. It began with the president's focus on rebuilding at home, the infrastructure bill, and much more. So that is very much a part of our overall strategy, as is the strengthening of relationships with key allies and partners. And that has involved not just the addressing some longstanding disputes like the Boeing Airbus dispute, but also a great degree of coordination. Last week, the president was in Europe, and these topics were front and center. Another key element of our engagement with allies and partners is to put forward positive visions, and that would include our Indo-Pacific strategy, which was released not long ago, and our Indo-Pacific economic framework. So we are putting forward, I think, a positive vision of how we view the Indo-Pacific region. But with China itself, the secretary, when he first started in his confirmation hearings, made clear that he views the relationship as mainly competitive, with adversarial dimensions, and with some areas where our interests align. And I think that throughout this period, we've been focused very keenly on managing the competition responsibly, establishing guardrails, particularly in the areas of the relationship that are adversarial, but also leaving some space for work in areas where our interests align, not in a way that trades cooperation in those areas for other things, but because when our interests align, we will simply find that we will do things together. So that's essentially our framework for viewing the China relationship at present.
Rick, thank you so much. We have some questions starting to come in from folks who are viewing this discussion, and we're at that point where we want to turn to those questions. We have about 18 minutes or so left in our appointed time. Let me pose this question, and I think this is probably a question that's best addressed by Hans and perhaps Elizabeth, and then a second question that perhaps Rick could initially address. The first question, and I'm reading here from what has just come in, quote, recently it's been said Putin's top advisors are afraid to tell him the truth about the war. Do top Chinese officials have skewed perceptions of Taiwan as well, to the degree that they're ignoring populist sentiment? And me extrapolating from that question, as far as we can tell, Hans and Elizabeth, what do we know about the degree to which Chinese advisors to the leadership of China can tell the truth about various things that are happening? I think that is an interesting question and would value your take on it. Hans, maybe you could go first.
Well, there's no doubt that the Chinese leadership is aware of public sentiment on Taiwan. Taiwan's population is one of the most surveyed populations when it comes to questions like their future vis-a-vis China. Elizabeth hit on a point just a moment ago where she said, well, they don't necessarily care, right? So they're very aware of the sentiment, but I don't think they value that sentiment as powerful enough or sufficiently or sustainable enough to take it into serious consideration. On the other hand, in the past, the Chinese efforts at either enticing or coercing a change of opinion on Taiwan have failed. Missile tests in '96 failed. the economic, kind of an economic super engagement with Taiwan during the Ma Ying-jeou presidency failed and sparked the sunflower protests. And so they know, they might not care, but I also think they have a really hard time processing policy or tactics, I should say, from that information.
Thanks, Hans. Elizabeth, what's your take on whether people close to Xi Jinping can go to President Xi and tell him the truth about issue A or issue B? Is it possible, or are people, forced into a kind of yes man, yes woman type of role?
My understanding is that China has very good intelligence in Taiwan. They have very, very sophisticated intelligence apparatus embedded in Taiwan. So then it goes back to the question, they've got all the intelligence of the world. Is it getting to the right ears? Are the right ears listening to this? I wish I was a fly on the wall and don't on high. But let me tell you, probably after hearing that Putin was led astray by a bunch of yes men, Xi Jinping is probably asking the tougher questions right now. I mean, we have to give him credit for like thinking that one out, right? Like, what is really going on? I think another question, honestly, that I don't have the answer to is, are the people in Taiwan willing to fight? Now, Hans just mentioned, yes, there's that it's true. Taiwan is probably the most polled place in the world. And especially during this Ukraine war, a lot of Taiwanese increasingly saying, yes, I'm willing to fight. But it really comes down to it. Are they going to pick up those arms and defend the way we never anticipated that the Ukrainians would, right? But maybe the Ukrainians were more hardened by about 8 years of war in the Donbass region with Russia, whereas Taiwan, they haven't experienced that fighting, right? That type of war on their territory. And when the electromagnetic, the cyber stuff starts happening, and then the kinetic happens, and the boom, boom, boom happens, are they going to fight, or are they going to fold? I mean, I think the Taiwan government is right in that, the reservists, they're getting 4 months of training. Now it's going to be a year. They need a lot more training if they're going to really, have any hope of fighting and putting off either a Chinese attack, or once the Chinese are there, trying to beat them back. But I think that's the really big question. I don't know if anyone can answer now. Would the Taiwanese fight to the death?
Thank you so much. Rick, let me ask a question that's come in from one of our viewers, and I'm kind of paraphrasing the question, but you noted earlier that the president, the secretary of state, the national security advisor are all on the record, making it very clear to China that if China does anything to help Russia militarily or to blunt the impact of Western economic sanctions directed at Russia, that would be very, very problematic from the U.S. standpoint. My question to you, or the question that's been posed by one of our viewers, is what is your assessment? What is the U.S. government's assessment about what China is or is not doing presently with respect to assisting Russia in either the military sense or the economic sense? And to kind of put the question another way, what is the U.S. government's sense at this point for the degree of effectiveness of the call that President Biden had with President Xi, where this was obviously the most important topic discussed?
Thanks, David. Yeah, the question is an important one, and as you can tell from the amount of diplomatic focus we've been putting into this issue, we are quite concerned. The same, I think, goes for our European partners. And while I think all I can say about our assessment at this point is that we're watching and listening very carefully. The European summit tomorrow will be an interesting moment in which the Europeans and the Chinese will also discuss China's role in the Ukraine conflict, and our diplomatic effort focuses essentially on ensuring that the Chinese hear not just from us, but also from others about our shared concerns over these issues.
Great, thanks so much. Let me ask another question that I think is kind of a theme in what we're hearing from viewers, and that is, notwithstanding the um, difference in perspective, to put it mildly, on the issue of Ukraine, for example, but also a whole bunch of other issues in the U.S. China bilateral relationship where there clearly isn't a meeting of the minds between the United States and China on a whole range of issues, from human rights to Taiwan to the South China Sea and so on. To what degree is collaboration between the United States and China still feasible in real terms, realistically, on areas where there is a common interest, whether that's North Korea, and obviously North Korea has been in the news lately, whether that's climate change, whether it's the issue of Afghanistan, or a variety of other areas where there would seemingly still exist a common interest between the United States and China. Is it possible to kind of walk and chew gum at the same time and advance these other issues, notwithstanding some of the frictions that exist in these other areas? Rick, maybe I would just pose that to you first, and then perhaps go to Elizabeth and then to Hans if they would like to weigh in on that question as well.
Yeah, I mean, David, a good example, our Afghanistan envoy is actually in Anhui province today, and a statement will come out shortly, if it hasn't already, reflecting the discussions that happened on the ground. So, certainly we continue to maintain dialogue on a number of key regional issues: Afghanistan, Iran, the DPRK. And there are some areas in the bilateral relationship where we have a degree of coordination. Historically, this has also been the case. A lot of work was done on the issue of fentanyl in the 2018 timeframe. And while this remains a difficult problem for many Americans, the nature of the problem has evolved after the Chinese changed their laws to ban fentanyl as a class of drug. So I think those are a couple of examples of where there are still efforts underway in areas where our interests are aligned.
Okay. Elizabeth, anything you would add to what Rick has said in terms of U.S.-China collaboration on these other issues?
Yeah, sure. If you had asked me this question last year, I would have said yes, particularly on climate change, because there did seem to be an interest, in working with each other. I think that in the last, couple of months, I think there are fewer and fewer. Maybe it was after that Alaska debacle, that Alaska meeting that was just so acerbic, that I would say there's just fewer opportunities, I think, to get together and really talk as level on a diplomatic level. One thing I think that's going on is the TV cameras are off. I think a lot of this diplomacy. International relations diplomacy is a two-level game. There's the official track, and then there's like the more quiet behind the scenes, like Rick says about like the fentanyl. Like we don't see a lot of that in the media. But when the Chinese come out, hitting with their wolf warrior diplomacy and they're hitting against our guys, then we see that, right? So I think maybe it's good right now that diplomacy is on a quieter track with the TV cameras off. One thing that concerns me is that China is allowing fewer and fewer academics to come to the United States to participate in conferences. And even if they're not coming to the United States by Zoom. And so we're having fewer academic exchanges, and then there's less opportunity for dialogue, more opportunity for misunderstanding and miscommunication.
Elizabeth, thank you. Hans, what is your take on, where the relatively, and I use the word relatively, promising areas for U.S.-China collaboration are, as you see it? It is a tough environment. The politics of China in this country are very punishing, and we have midterms looming out there in the horizon. But what do you think are the areas where the United States and China can work together and need to work together to advance some common interests?
Well, David, you mentioned climate change. I mean, obviously, one as a global threat, that's something that both actors can address out of their own sense of national interest, and don't have to necessarily be doing it hand in hand. Security, or I should say, counterterrorism coordination or cooperation was an area I think we had some success in, at least in the last decade. Addressing the militarization of space might be an area where we could find common ground. I tend to agree that I think the areas where the sensational areas where we can actually cooperate seem to be disappearing. Here in Houston, Texas, where we pride ourselves on being a business town, and so a lot of folks here are very much looking forward to taking the politics out of business and getting back to business, whether it's oil and gas industry, technology, healthcare, et cetera. There's just so much potential there, but it comes with an increasing political costs these days. If I could, just one other point, and that is, reflection of American political culture these days, where we went from an Obama presidency to a Trump presidency to a Biden presidency. And so the Chinese are looking for something a little consistent, a little durable. And I think they're wondering how much skin to put in any single game with us if it's too close to 4 years later or the next election.
Let me ask one last question, just in terms of the questions that have come in, and we won't have time to go through all of them. I think this will need to be the last one, and we can kind of do a lightning round for a total of about 3 minutes. So maybe 1 minute each from each of our distinguished panelists. And maybe starting with Rick, and I know this is a tough question, from a USG standpoint, but the question has come in, if China were to attack Taiwan, in the wake of what has happened in terms of Russia, Ukraine, any sense for how the United States would react to such a scenario? And I totally understand that as a hypothetical, et cetera, but let me at least put it out there since that question came in, and then we can go on the same question to Elizabeth and Hans and then wrap up.
Well, David, I'm sure you'll appreciate after your 18 years in the Foreign Service that one never answers a hypothetical. But can I just briefly, in the 1 minute I have allotted to me, I wanted to go back to something Elizabeth had said. The area of welcoming Chinese citizens into our country, I think, is widely misunderstood, particularly including in parts of our country. We have issued well over 100,000 visas to Chinese students since we reopened our visa sections last year. Our team on the ground is doing this under very difficult conditions. They have to go through 4 weeks of quarantine, including here, before they get on the flights to get to post and to do this. And it's a reflection, I think, of how much we think it is important to continue the interchange between the two peoples. There are a very small number of people who come over from China who break our laws, and our law enforcement agencies act accordingly. But I just wanted to emphasize that one point because I couldn't agree more with Elizabeth that we need to keep scholarly exchange alive. We need to keep students coming here. This is a critical thing both for the relationship and for our own interests.
Rick, thanks so much. And just to conclude the lightning round, Hans, to take a complex issue and just boil it down, what do you think as a private citizen, as a scholar, someone who's very expert in these issues, the United States would do in a scenario in which China attacks Taiwan? This is the question that's on people's mind, of course, in the context of Ukraine. And then Elizabeth, same question to you. And each of you have about 45 seconds for that little question, and then I'll wrap up for the evening.
Well, to answer but not answer the question, David, I think the Ukraine conflict has really reminded us that there's a master plan, there's a strategy, but once it hits the light of day, everything else ends up being a whole collection of if-then statements. So how does China attack Taiwan? Does it start with the offshore islands of Xiamen or Penghu, and then we have a chance to recalculate what is the condition of our alliances at the time? The Indo-Pacific, is it coming along? Is it consolidating? The Japanese, the South Koreans, what role would India be willing to play if there was some sort of conflict? at least as far as the Indian Ocean goes. And so I think we have to answer that question with a collection of scenarios. Is an attack preceded by cyber attacks to soften the infrastructure, or does it launch right away with missile and amphibious attacks? So I hate to punt, but it really does depend on the scenario.
That's a very fair statement, Hans. And Elizabeth, I'll give the last word to you, maybe 30 seconds just to.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be brief. I don't know. All right. We don't know. Again, I agree with Hans that it would depend on the context, what was happening. I mean, we've got the TRA, but, that just obligates us to sell more arms to Taiwan. So, defense is best offense. Let's raise the cost to China, busting a move, and they'll be hopefully a bit more reticent.
Elizabeth, thank you. And let me just say as we conclude, Rick, Elizabeth, Hans, thank you all so much for being with us this evening, for sharing your deep insights and expertise on all of these issues. We really appreciate it. For me, it's a great pleasure to have a chance to moderate this session with all of you and to learn from all of you on these really important topics. Let me also say how pleased again we are at the George H.W. Bush Foundation for U.S. China Relations to collaborate with our really great friends at Asia Society Texas, with Selena, with May, and with the whole team there. We're grateful for the collaboration. We're delighted to have had an opportunity to delve into these really important issues, and we look forward to working together again. And thank you all again so much for being a part of this.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, David.